morning, everyone. Today is May 19th, 2022, and welcome to this installment of the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan in the spring of 2020. Every week, Natalie, Sarah Agamiri, Jean Lawler, who's not with us today, and I host another cutting-edge webinar on topics related to negotiation, mediation, communication skills, lawyering in general. We hope it's helpful to you. There's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask people to contribute to a food bank, either one suggested by our great speakers or another one in your own area if you're in a position to do so. And our generous audiences have just been so wonderfully, wonderfully generous, donating in honor of our terrific speakers. And one of the best parts of the program every week is when we give the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed to date. Natalie, would you please do the honors?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you, Peter Coleman, for volunteering to be our presenter today. We're really excited to support your food bank, but of course we encourage everyone watching the video or with us here live to support the food bank that is near and dear to your heart. And so far, Will Work for Food to date has raised $278,319.85. Well done, everyone. We hope that you will consider making a donation of any size. $1 can buy 10 meals. So please make a donation to the food bank that you choose.
Magnificent. Thank you so much, Natalie. And now to our presentation today. We're very delighted to have Professor Peter Coleman of Columbia University in New York City. He's the author of an absolutely terrific book called The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. I read a review of the book on the website of the Greater Good Science Center from the University of California, Berkeley, and just reached out to Professor Coleman, and he was so magnanimous and instantly agreed to do the webinar. We're just so happy. Let me briefly introduce him as described here in the back flap of the book. Peter T. Coleman is a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at Teachers College, from which my daughter Brianna has a degree, and the Earth Institute, and directs 2 research centers. He is the author of Making Conflict Work: Harnessing the Power of Disagreement, 2014, and The 5%, Finding Solutions to Seemingly Impossible Conflict, 2011, among other books. And of course, The Way Out, I recommend highly. I just finished it a few days ago. It's just a terrific, terrific book. Professor Coleman, please tell us a little bit about the food bank that's important to you, to which you would like people to contribute if they're able, and then on to the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation. Yes, the food bank I'm eliciting support for is a local food bank. I live on the Upper West Side of New York City, and this bank is housed in a house of worship on 86th Street and West End Avenue on the corner, and they do incredible work in the community, have for decades served the community in terms of their food bank. So that's my recommendation is please reach out to them and help them. There's a large needy population in the area that congregate there daily for basic support. So
what's it called?
That's a good question. I forget the name, but it's maybe we can. We'll find it before the end of the.
Okay, talk. I think Natalie, we've posted it in the chat.
Oh
yes, it's the West Side Campaign Against Hunger.
That's it.
At wschah.org.
Maybe you can put it in the chat. That would help us all.
It's there.
Thank you, Natalie. Thanks for remembering. Okay, well, I will get started with my time today, and I hope to leave time for some questions. I am an academic at Columbia, but I'm also a mediator, and I do a lot of work in dispute resolution of different types. And I tend to work in 3 buckets. One is we do research on mediation, negotiation, organizational conflict, community conflict. And then I also work in two more extreme areas. I work in the study of long-term, seemingly intractable, entrenched, sometimes culturally entrenched conflicts, like the political conflict in the US today, which I'll talk about. We also study the opposite side of the equation, which are sustainably peaceful societies. It may come as a surprise to many of you, but around the world, there are societies that are internally or regionally peaceful. There are what they call peace systems, which are clusters of either communities or nations that sort of have a pact to be in peace with each other. And so we study those and try to study the conditions that lead to kind of ongoing peacefulness, because it's one thing to get out of long-term difficult conflicts. It's another thing to sustain peace, and they require sort of different lenses and a different understanding. But today I'm going to talk about sort of addressing political polarization in America and what that might mean for you and your practice and how you think about conflict. And I'm going to share some slides so that you can follow along. Pull that up. Can we see those? Sarah, Jeff, all good? Yeah, okay, great.
Perfect.
Great, okay. So I'll start with a little background as to why it's called The Way Out, how to overcome toxic polarization. And I'll tell you how I got started with this. We run a lab at Columbia called the Difficult Conversations Lab, where for about 2 decades now, we've brought in people who are on different sides of a morally divisive issue. And we study the conditions under which those conversations go well or don't go well. And because of that, when Donald Trump was elected, when sort of political vitriol and hate started to really become pervasive in the news, and people started to become more and more concerned with the state of democracy in America and politics in America, there are several groups started to approach us because we do research on, dialogue and difficult conversations. One of which is this group called My Country Talks. And this started in Germany with Germany Talks, then became My Country Talks, and multiple nations joined it. Recently, there's been a version called America Talks. And this is, again, a kind of a well-intentioned initiative to try to bring people together across political divisions and get to know each other. And it's again, an idea that comes from something called contact theory, the contact hypothesis, some of you may be familiar with, but this is just the idea when you have groups, members of different groups, can be racial groups, religious groups, political groups, that are not in touch with each other, that don't live in close proximity to each other, don't have contact with each other, then under those conditions, if there is conflict and tension emerging, it is useful to encourage people to just sort of come together, meet one another, get a sense of the humanity of each other, and that can oftentimes reduce suspiciousness and reduce kind of negative, more destructive dynamics. However, these days, with political divisions in America and with the extreme nature of some of the beliefs and ideologies associated with the different tribal camps of our red and blue politics, sometimes contact, just encouraging people to come together, is not a good idea. So what this group does is they encourage people to go to a website, fill out a survey of some divisive issues, and then they match you with someone in your community who is on the other side of a politically divisive issue, like immigration and building the wall. And then they encourage you to go off either on Zoom or face-to-face and have a cup of coffee and talk. And again, under most conditions, that's a great idea and can be very helpful. What we're finding today is under current conditions, it oftentimes backfires. So this group out of Germany that started this initiative featured this illustration of this, which was that when Donald Trump was elected, this Bastian Bergner, who works for Die Zeit, which is a popular German periodical, came to America, was interested in understanding the divide, the pro-Trump, anti-Trump divide, met these two gentlemen, befriended them and followed them, reported on them for about a year, and really felt that he got to know them as, decent, caring, smart people, and was in conversation with them for quite a bit of time, and then decided, why don't we just bring them together? And so they did. They came together in New York City for a breakfast and a walk in Central Park, and then they met after a basketball game in Brooklyn one night. And everything went very well until somebody mentioned the controversy over Colin Kaepernick and the protest, Black Lives Matter protest with the NFL that he was kind of a figurehead in. And at that point, the conversation exploded. And one man who was a veteran felt really strongly about this. The other man, who was more progressive and liberal, felt really strongly about this. They got up, started screaming, F-bombs started to fly, and then they walked out and refused to ever come back and talk to the journalist or each other again. Unfortunately, these kinds of blow-ups are happening more frequently. Pew did a study looking at how people felt after talking to a member of the other side, and the majority of us, particularly liberals, leave these conversations feeling frustrated and alienated, more so than they did beforehand. So simply encouraging people with different political ideologies and oftentimes different news sources, different social media environments, to just come together and talk, in my view, these days is unethical, unless you know how to do that. And so that's what I really want to talk about, is what does it take to make those conversations useful? Because when you have true believers on this side or this side, encouraging people just to get together and talk doesn't work. So let me talk just briefly about this concept of toxic polarization and what it is, some of the science of how we got stuck on what is a multi-decade pattern of increasing political polarization in this country, and then mostly on what we can do about it. And I'll give you kind of a high-level taste of that. If there are any questions, please let me know as we go. I can also take questions at the end. Let me give you some sense of what I mean by toxic polarization, concerns around toxic polarization. What we're seeing today, depending on what you measure, are extreme spikes that have existed for decades. Affective polarization is usually what's measuring, and that's the feeling of warmth and care for your own group and hate and contempt for the other group. That has been on the rise since the 1970s. You can see here, this is up to 2017 with unfavorable ratings into the 80%, a very unfavorable, almost at 50%. So there are strong feelings that the other side is unintelligent, selfish, and intentionally trying to harm us or harm our democracy. There are increases in what we call ideological thinking or consistency, tribal thinking, which means that Pew studies 10 distinct issues and how conservatives or liberals generally view those issues. And there used to be a fair amount of overlap between them because they're 10 very different kinds of issues. But what we're seeing more and more is that Republican and Democrats' views within their groups become very consistent across all of these issues, and they've become further apart from one another in their camps. Essentially, what this means is that instead of paying attention to the nuance of issues of immigration, healthcare, gay rights, abortion, which are all fundamentally different things, we just sort of follow the party line and pay much less attention and think and advocate in much more simplistic ways. So we're not thinking or understanding these issues with sufficient nuance. There's also a collapse of complexity in our identities. What we're starting to see within the parties is a fusion of not only just ideology, but religion and racial and political identities coming together. And political divisions are the most acute divisions in the country today, but they're, again, correlated with race and others. And then there are a couple of very concerning trends. One is an increase in perceptual distortion. We believe, our group believe, that those on the other side are more extreme in their attitudes and more extreme in their political activism than they really are. But if we believe that, it tends to elicit in us more extreme reactions and responses and feelings. And it is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy or a vicious cycle. So this misperception or a gap in perception between where they actually are and what we see them to be, where we see them to stand, is part of what's feeding this pattern of exclusion and divisiveness. In times like this, where there are such divisions and so much content on social media, what tends to happen is that the more extreme voices control the discourse. That's true on mainstream, many versions of mainstream media and on social media. On Twitter, 80% of the content that is posted on Twitter comes from about 10% of the participants, and others are more passive observers or consumers of this information. That's one of the reasons why we believe that the other side is more extreme, because the voices that are out there are more extreme. And then most concerning are two things. One is that we're physically moving away from each other. Geographic visual sorting, not just rural urban divides, but also even within the cities. The New York Times did a piece on this study that came out about a year ago, which is showing how even within urban areas, you have this blue and red sorting taking place, so that Democrats are moving away from Republicans towards Democrats and vice versa. And this is a recipe for violence. This is what we've seen in other nations. For example, in India, where you have Hindu-Muslim violence at high rates, you see groups of people, large groups of people that are living in close proximity to one another, but physically sort of distinct or isolated from one another. And that's where intergroup conflicts can spark much higher levels of violence. This is, by the way, where I live on the Upper West Side, in this bastion of blue, but not far from some purple places, which is important to note. The last thing I'll talk about in terms of concerns in these trends are rises in hate groups, hate crimes, and political violence, which we are seeing. White nationalist hate groups grew 55% during the Trump era. We've seen some of the implications of that just this week in the horrible shooting in Buffalo, but reported hate crimes have been on the rise across the country in most states and in many urban areas. And a lot of this is fed by political rhetoric in the media and elsewhere. So to summarize, this poll that came out in last September, 80% of Biden voters, 84% of Trump voters view officials from the other party as presenting a clear and present danger to American democracy. Just listen to that language. 40% of Biden voters, half of Trump voters favor red blue states seceding from the Union to form their own separate country. 30% of Republicans, 40% of trust in far-right news, and 11% of Democrats are ready to resort to violence today to save the country. That's approximately 40 million Americans that are ready to fight in a country where there are something like 400 million guns, mostly owned by the right. So that's the kind of context that we're in. But this isn't new. This is a trend. This is governmental. These are voting in Congress, in the House and the Senate, since 1879, so just after the US Civil War, when obstructionism and lack of bipartisanship was very high. And then we sort of moved into a period for, between 1924 and the 1980s that where there was much more compromise and progress in both the House and the Senate. But then starting about the mid 70s, late 60s, early 70s, we start to see this increase in divisiveness, in obstructionism in our leadership in Washington, and an enmity and vitriol, to the point where today we are like in almost total deadlock. It's very uncommon for people to cross the aisle and support legislation that had been posed by the other side. And so we see this dysfunction that I'm talking about, not just in Washington, not just on Main Street in our homes, families, and communities, but really all up and down the spectrum. And we are in some ways exceptional on this. This is a form of American exceptionalism. This is a fairly recent poll that came out looking at various different country groups, and we, the United States of America, are the most extreme in our political polarization and affective polarization in this country, in our views of the other side. And again, that's been happening for decades. So, to summarize, we're a nation trapped in this decades-long movement of increasing toxic polarization. It is highly addictive. There's brain science research on this that shows that feelings of outrage and a taste of retaliation to get back at the other side is an addictive substance that lights up parts of our brains like narcotics do. And the media understands this. Social media platforms understand this, and they prey on that and they play on that. And it is making us sick. We see spikes in depression, suicide, drug addiction at different levels, particularly younger people. Historians like John Meacham and Doris Kearns Goodwin are drawing parallels today with the US in the 1850s, just before our last civil war, because at that time there was also a secessionist movement, major disinformation campaigns, and profound distrust in our electoral system, which we all have today. And today, about 70% of us feel that political violence is likely to increase in the near future. And unfortunately, our political leaders sit at the epicenter of this. And they oftentimes perpetuate these divisions and are unlikely to be able to do much to stem the tide of political contempt. I worked with the Biden transition team a bit when they were coming on and they were trying to think about how to depolarize America. And, you know, unfortunately, because half the country believes that they've stolen the election, it's very difficult for them to do things other than to not make matters worse. But I do think that we citizens can. There are many things we can do. One of the things I want to point out is that polarization is not a bad thing in a two-party system. It's good to have strong, true believers who are informed and sort of, you know, championing their position to try to push us forward in a better union. There was a time in the 1950s when the political parties were very close to one another, a lot of overlap in their policies and positions, and we were sort of calling for a need for more separation between the two. But today we've gotten to this place where this is moral conversations over moral issues between Democrats and Republicans. And what you see here is that Republicans mostly communicate with Republicans, Democrats in the blue mostly communicating, this is on Twitter, with Democrats, very little communication between them other than disparaging remarks. So this is an image that captures the kind of state of our experience in America. So you may wonder, how did we get into this 60-year trajectory since the 70s of increasing enmity and hate? And if you read the literature, and there is a lot of writing on political polarization in America, they cite many specific reasons. And some of them are more micro level reasons, like differences in brain sensitivity to messages of threat, or differences in, comfort with authoritarianism and leadership, loneliness epidemic, and need to join tribes. There are many kind of more micro level factors and many macro level factors, including the fact that we have this two-party system, and ultimately people have to choose between two candidates, and that is a divisive process that isn't shared around the world, but it's dominant here. Government dysfunction, negative political campaigning, which is effective in the short term and toxic in the long term, voter suppression, rising inequality, etc. So there are many reasons why we're stuck in this pattern, and they don't operate kind of one at a time, but they kind of feed each other. That when we have a particular attitude, it shapes our preferences for the news and what we watch. And we don't pay attention to certain information, pay much more attention to others. This develops like neural pathways in our brains that make processing information that contradicts it much harder. So these are dynamics that happen, and they don't just happen in our brain and in our processing, but they happen across levels. This is like addiction. This is a biopsychosocial structural problem that we're in. There are biological, neurological reasons why we're so easily triggered and polarized, psychological reasons. It's in our relationships, who we talk to, who we don't talk to, where we travel and visit and go on vacation, where we don't travel and visit, the media we watch, the ecosystems of our social media, and the algorithms that sort us, and on and on. So there are multiple layers to this divisiveness, but mostly what happens is these things start to feed each other as vicious cycles and pull us apart, so that even if we get fed up, we can easily fall into and get sucked back into being triggered by them as, you know, enemies. This is something that Karl Popper, who is a very notable philosopher of science in the last 100 years, called cloud problems. He said that in science or in life, humans face two categories of problems. One are clock problems, which are things that, like a clock, can break and you can take it apart and find the missing piece, fix it and put it back together. That's how we tend to think about most problems. That's our policy approach. That's our mediation approach. It's like, well, let's find the essence of the problem and fix it. Other problems are what he would call cloud problems. These are big, infinite, changing, dynamic things which are really hard to predict and control. And what happens oftentimes is these kinds of cloud problems settle into patterns that become addictive. There's something we call attractors. So let me give you a taste of how this happens. So imagine if you are at your favorite diner. This is your Saturday morning, you're at your diner, you love this place, go in, you order your favorite breakfast, you're ready to go. And then in walks some guy who you've never seen before, right? Somebody who's new, and they come over and they could sit any place in the diner, but they choose for whatever reason to sit directly next to you on the stool next to you. And not only do they sit next to you, but they kind of splay out, they kind of spread out. And in doing so, kind of touch you, right? Touch your arm, touch your body. So again, no big deal, doesn't really matter. It's a little odd, but whatever, but it's irritating, right? Then you start to pay attention to this person and how he treats the waitress and what he orders, and what he's wearing. And suddenly you start to think, oh, I know what's going on here. This guy is just a jerk, right? He just is. And so you start to, even before any kind of communication between you, get a sense that you'd start to develop a bit of a grudge. And then you start to kind of express your frustration, maybe not even in words, maybe just in facial expressions or sighing or pushing back a little bit on the arm. And he starts to feel your negativity. And suddenly the two of you are creating this little mini system of conflict, right? Of destructive conflict. Well, lo and behold, it turns out that he's actually moved here, comes back when you're there, sometimes brings his friends, and you're starting to feel, you know, you have your friends and colleagues and, you know, people that work there that you know, that you're comfortable with. He has his, and they're clearly separate groups. And then you start to realize at some point that they are responding to political content, images on television that connect them to a larger division, right? Suddenly you're like, oh, I see, they're one of them, right? Then the pattern gets even bigger and thicker, and it becomes even more difficult. You're even triggered on the street when you see one of their friends walk by. You feel this grudge, you feel this resentment. And this gets to a place where it becomes extremely difficult to feel or think or do anything different than either avoid them or feel a need to, you know, attack, challenge, confront them. And this is what we call a pattern that happens over time. And what's important is that there may be an incident, this kind of moment that we're in right now, But part of why we're in it is because of the constellation and combination of these experiences over time that create a way that we experience the world that are what physicists call attractor dynamics. They draw us in. Like addiction, they draw us into feelings and behaviors that maybe we're not proud of or would prefer not to do, but we can't help it, right? There's too much drawing us into that. So with these kinds of problems that are so cloudy and attractive, we have to think differently about how to change them. Fixing them, going into like a clock, find the thing and fix it, is insufficient to the problem. Encouraging people just to get together and have a conversation is insufficient to this problem. So we've been working with complexity science, area of applied mathematics, psychology, and what I know from peace and conflict studies to create a new way of thinking about these things. And we've done a lot of research on these things and published a bunch of books, including this one, which is particularly focused on the political divisions in our country and how to find a way out of them. So let me say some good news. So I have studied long-term intractable, seemingly intractable conflicts in societies and the conditions under which those societies sometimes stop and pivot. Sometimes they choose intentionally to end war or civil violence and move out of that to a different time. And what the research tells us is that there are some basic conditions when societies and individuals are more likely to do that. First is that you need to have enough of us in the middle that are just miserable, fed up with the status quo and really just looking for another way. We don't like being triggered. We don't like the vitriol and the hate, and we want something else. And that kind of misery is good. And the good news is that we've got plenty of it. There's a group called More in Common, which studies and puts out a report called The Hidden Tribes of America. And they see that something like 86% of Americans in the middle, not the extreme wings, but the more middle, are what they call the exhaustive majority. We are fed up. We don't want this anymore. We want to find another way out. And this is another study that came out last year in July, similar kinds of numbers. So that's good news. It's good news that there is in our country a large cohort of us who are probably largely disengaged from the political discourse, but fed up and looking for an alternative, because those are the conditions where you start to see change. It's also helpful when there are strong patterns like this, when communities and societies are destabilized, ruptured by some kind of shock, some kind of political event. Sometimes in international affairs, it's an assassination or a coup attempt or something highly destabilizing. Well, our country has had COVID and a spike in awareness of racial injustice, right? And a huge economic downturn. Last year alone, we saw 47 million people, Americans, voluntarily quit their job, what they're calling the Great Resignation. 47 million people. That's how many workers are there in America? 150 million, something like that. That's almost a third of the workforce that said, I want to stop what I'm doing and do something different. That's good news, because it does mean that people are more reflective and willing to kind of review their own decision assumptions and maybe make new choices. So those are conditions that are fruitful for people and communities changing course. But what they need is a sense of what to do, right? When you're triggered, when you feel this pull, what can I do to change course? And that's why I wrote this book. And what I've done in this book is cherry pick from science. Some of it's our original research, some of it's research from elsewhere, on 5 categories of activities. These are scientific principles that have implications for you and your life, for your relationships, for your family, for your workplace, for your community, scaling all the way up to our nation, that have implications for what you can do to pivot and find your way out. And this is where I think there may be some practical implications for you and your practice and your work. So let me just give you a high-level taste of these things. I'll say I wrote an article in Time magazine published on the anniversary of January incursion in the Capitol. That's a high-level summary of this, so you can read that or buy the book. And each of these principles and recommendations has a chapter with illustrations of what to do. So again, if we're like an addict, you know, when addicts hit bottom and are either at their worst or they're confronted by their family and really need to change, what matters oftentimes is what they do first. Like, how do they, what's their way out? Do they reach out to an AA sponsor? Do they join a community like that in order to change their patterns? So the first steps really matter. And one of the things that affects that is our assumptions about change. Do you believe that Americans can change, that the Republicans will ever change, that the Democrats will ever change, that I'll ever change? One piece of what we will do next is based on our assumptions about change. This comes out of research from Israel-Palestine. And what they find is that, you know, if you believe that they're never going to change. If I'm an Israeli and I believe Palestinians are never going to change, the situation is never going to change, we're never going to change, well, then what are my options? My options are, if I can, to totally disengage from the process, from the political conversation, or if I have to engage with them, I fight them. But if I believe, if I'm an Israeli and I hear a Palestinian talk about, yeah, I used to advocate violence, but now what I'm doing is working for peace and I'm trying to socialize children in different ways. And if I hear them talk about their changing, then it opens me up to the possibility that maybe people can change, and maybe I could engage with this in a fundamentally different way. So just a simple distinction about what we assume to be true about the possibility for change is one thing to be mindful of when you attempt to reset. All right. The second principle is based on something that we call positive deviance. And this is the idea that we learned this from the international peace building, that what we learn more and more is that when international peace builders go into a conflict zone with their own plans and programs, they usually fail. They usually backfire or are unsustainable. But what oftentimes is particularly useful is when you identify local actors that have found ways to bring the sides together quietly, respectfully. Those are much more likely programs or initiatives to succeed and be sustained. And this is an idea called positive deviance, or islands of agreement. Gabriella Bloom has written a book about the existence of these in war zones. And this is understanding that when you're in these highly polarized communities, you want to find what's already working. This is what a colleague of mine, Laura Chasm, called, where are the networks of effective action? Are there people talking to each other that are, in some ways, they're the community immune system that is trying to fight hate and vitriol locally on the ground, and have figured out how to do that there, right? So I wrote this article on building peace in America through positive deviance and give examples of that. But just to give you a specific illustration, the good news on this is that this is a group out of Princeton called the Bridging Divides Initiative. It is a clearinghouse of information. If you go to their website, there is this interactive map of America. What they're finding and plotting is information about bridge building groups and organizations across the country that are doing good work to bring people together, right? And they're doing work that's well facilitated and well designed. And so they have a lot of sort of information about these groups. And you can go to it and click on the map and then toggle into your area. And you find that there are places that have, you know, if you go to any kind of specific place like Pittsburgh, you can find where are the specific areas within Pittsburgh where you actually see, you know, bridge building activities. So you can find groups that are already doing this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. A simpler analogy of this is if you think about your own family or friend group, and you think about, is there someone that you think has a lot of equanimity, a lot of is kind of a peacemaker, is just a person that even in tense times is able to listen and hear and bring people together. Reach out to them first, right? Try to find those people that are skilled at that in our personal lives and in these political times, and spend time with them, emulate them, learn from them. These are what we call positive deviants. Another group, the Bridging Divides Initiative, is community-based. The Bridge Alliance, which some of you may be familiar with, are 100 different organizations that do this work in different sectors, in media, in government, in politics. So you can go to the Bridge Alliance and find those organizations as well. All right. 3 other points, and then I'll take questions. So one of the big takeaways from our research is the need under times like this where the conversation becomes simplistic, overly simplistic. When we take something as complicated as immigration and talk about it as building a wall or not building a wall, then we need to reintroduce complexity and nuance into our thinking, into our feeling. It's a critical component. And so, how do you do this? Well, one way I do this every day is when I watch the news and something breaks, there's a story that breaks, like the leaked document that came out a week or 2 ago from the Supreme Court. What I'm interested in is, we all go to the news that is most comforting to us and that feels most familiar to us. But what I intentionally have done is identify a handful of sources, these are individuals or news sources, that can provide me with news from the other side, from a political position opposite to my own, from people who I think are decent, well-intentioned, and well-informed. I may differ with them fundamentally politically, but I feel like they're in it for the right reasons. They're well-informed, even if I differ. So what I do intentionally when the news breaks is I change the channel. I go to Twitter. I watch people and follow people that will challenge me so that it's not just my comfort zone of information that I stay in, but I really challenge myself in terms of how I think. And let me say one group that's doing this is in a sector is Solutions Journalism Group. And they have this initiative called Complicating the Narrative, which is looking at how reporters, journalists contribute to polarization. How does their business model and their manner of reporting make things worse? And are there ways to mitigate that? Are there ways to share the news, to have a successful reporting career and not just be oversimplifying and dichotomizing problems? So this is a group that is trying to complicate how the news is reported to the benefit of all of us. All right, 2 other things. So this might be something that is somewhat unique to some of you. In my world, as a mediator, as a peace builder, what we are trying to do is bring people to the table, right? Get them to sit down and talk and work things out. And again, vast majority of time, that's very useful, very helpful, moves people forward. We get to yes, we get to agreements. But sometimes with some issues, when the differences are really rooted in our neurological structures, what we can process and not process, our feelings are very intense, our ideologies or beliefs are very coherent, then sometimes what can help is movement. Physical movement is us, ourselves, getting up, physically going for a walk, trying to do something different, or ideally inviting somebody from the other side of the equation to go for a walk with you, ideally outside, side by side in nature. That tends to trigger a neurological process related to what are called mirror neurons, which sort of moves us in sync. And we learned this from the study of marching bands, dance troops, combat troops, that when people protest movements, when people physically move together, there is a physiological connection that happens, is fostered. And in some ways, it is a secret weapon. It's a secret trick that you can use if you feel really stuck, and your brother-in-law is dogmatic, and every time you talk, it gets bad. You might say, let's go for a walk. Let's go for a walk. outside, in public, side by side, and see if that at least helps engender a different kind of dynamic, enough to at least agree to disagree civilly and respectfully. This is an initiative in the Middle East called Abraham's Path. Bill Urey and others created this. And this is based on research from neuroscience, and is enacted in this multi-denominational religious trek that follows Abraham's path with his family across many nations. It's also an economic development project, but it's a project that encourages people across religious differences to come together and trek and walk together. And it builds on these principles. All right, and then finally, the bad news. The bad news is, I started with the bad news, I'm going to end with that this work is hard. That given the constellation of things that are acting on us to divide us intentionally or unintentionally and pull us apart, this work, this change is going to take time. It's not an easy thing to do. We're likely to fail. We're likely to try some things and it's going to blow up and not work. And so the question is, how do we think about the long game? How do we orient ourselves to change in our own lives, our families, our communities, that is mindful of the fact that this has taken us a long time to get into, and it's going to take some time and effort and persistence to sustain progress to get out of it. We can eventually move into a qualitatively different place, but that will take time. This is based on research by Dietrich Dorner, who's a German psychologist who studied things like this. This is a game called the Peace Game, which is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what he offers in this book and in what I offer in this chapter on adapting is a way of making decisions and behaving that is more likely to help over time. That these are not quick fixes, that they are going to take strategies that are more longer term strategies. And so what are those? And what are some of the nudges that you can make in your life to move us forward? So I'll say that the book culminates in a set of what I call new rules. These are simple nudges that you can consider if you feel triggered or inclined to, perseverate or ruminate, on them and their insanity. What are some of the things that you can do to interrupt that and to start to shift and move in a different direction? So I'll leave it at that. If you go to the website, there are many exercises and ideas and video and media relevant to this, but I'll stop there and take questions or turn it over to you, Jeff.
Well, that was just terrific, Peter. Thank you so much. You summarized so much that's in the book, and I'm glad I read the book, and I commend it to everybody here. It's well worth the read. So let me ask you a rather pedestrian question. Those of us who work in the mediation of ordinary disputes, somebody claims they were discriminated against, wrongfully terminated, sexually harassed at work. Somebody claims that a contract partner delivered non-conforming goods under a contract. Just the clock problems. What are some things that, and yet even in those clock situations, we can find that there are people from dramatically different cultures, the cultures of employees and the culture of employers, the culture of vendors and the culture of buyers, and people in different industries, or people from different parts of the country, or alumni of different schools, or whatever it happens to be. So in some of these clock problems, what are some things that we can do to help people when the polarization seems to be overwhelming the substance of the conflict at hand?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, your question is about a different talk, because what I'm trying to talk about are those long-term embedded, very difficult conflicts like political polarization and what to do. We have done a lot of research on mediation and a model that we call adaptive mediation. And what we did is interview mediators that work on difficult cases and try to identify the main things that derail them, right? That sort of get you to a point where you think, I got to end this. This is not working. And there were four. One is, acute intensity of the conflict and, lack of safety and potential for violence. One is extreme constraints on the situation, time constraints, money constraints, cultural or more, legal constraints that really handcuff your capacity to open the conversation up. Another is when issues are covert, people aren't willing to talk about them, there are hidden agendas or sensitive issues that they can't talk about. And then finally, it's when there's just a purely competitive dynamic. There's no relationship, there's no need for win-win, there's no opportunity for that. It really is purely competitive. Those were the 4 derailers that we found from mediation. And so what we've developed is a kind of repertoire of stepping into different roles as a mediator. I was trained as a mediator. I'm trained in an integrative approach to try to find common ground, to try to do it respectfully. And sometimes that hits a wall. And so when it hits a wall, what are the different kinds of activities that you can do to bring the dispute or the conversation back into what's possible in mediation? This is a process we call adaptive mediation. We have a piece coming out in the Harvard Business Review on this. I work on this with a guy named Josh Flax, who's a federal mediator. So I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to come back and talk about that approach, which I'm very happy to do, because I think there are useful strategies that I wasn't trained in as a mediator about containing extremely intense, difficult situations, about probing more kind of therapeutically underneath some of the dynamics. How do you do those things? Happy to go there, but I will say that again, mediators most of the time have figured out some of these strategies and know how to manage most mediations. That's why mediation is so popular and successful, right? And oftentimes effective and more sustainable. But when the differences are as profound and cultural as the ones I just described, then mediation, what certainly in international affairs, what we find is that mediation usually doesn't help. And usually it can cause more problems. And so we need to think about how to intervene in those situations in radically different ways.
Okay, when that article comes out, we'd love to have you back.
That sounds great, yeah.
Thank you. Let's open it up. We have many people here who may want to ask questions. If you can just unmute yourself, feel welcome just to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Either people are overwhelmed, underwhelmed, saturated with information. It's always hard to know. But I'm happy to, talk about anything.
I'll start with the question.
Great.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm going to buy your book. I'm going to read it from cover to cover. Okay.
Fantastic.
I'm very fascinated by it. Because you're at a university and because I also teach at a university, what are your ideas about a university as one of these, what did you call them? Bubbles of, a latent bubbles of places where people can, because people at universities do come from very different places. Have you found your own classes or the university environment as a place where you can try these theories out?
It's a great question. My colleague Jonathan Haidt has written a lot about, and others, has written a lot about the kind of, strong liberal bent of most universities and colleges in this country. Not all, but most. And so in that space, a space that is much more politically progressive, certainly disputes over political differences are very difficult. I remember when Donald Trump was elected, going and teaching that night, Wednesday night, the night after the election in my class, and having students weeping in class. So it's definitely one of the challenges is that these spaces tend to be really skewed in one direction and not the other. And when divisions come up, I was teaching around 9/11. So right after 9/11, there were some I teach conflict and conflict resolution, and there were some very divisive conversations in my class because Some would argue that this, America was blindsided, was a victim of insanity and terrorism. And other people with more of a radical perspective said, no, our policies brought this on. We are contributors to this. This is we're sowing the seeds from many generations of our foreign policies. Those, as you can imagine, in that context, those conversations got explosive. And so, yes, those are the times when I need to move into a space. You have your teaching and your academic intentions, and then you have a process like that just emerges. And like I described with mediation and being derailed, it's important to be able to say, okay, it's necessary to move into a different space right now. And in this space, these are the rules, and this is how this will work. And so you really move into more of a dialogue process with certain guidelines and norms, and encourage the conversation to go forward as much as you can, given the time constraints of a class, but not, try to move on as business as usual. And again, that's always a judgment call as an educator, because they are profoundly teachable moments. So there can be really powerful learnings that come from them, but they're also very difficult challenges to you as a teacher and as an educator, particularly if you're not trained in it, right? And are not comfortable with dialogue facilitation, enforcing ground rules, etc. So yes, I've had, because of the content I teach, there are oftentimes issues of racial differences or political differences that bubble up and that get tense. And then your question as an educator is this something that I need to really shift mode, be explicit about that, get people to buy in and see the utility of that, and then take the time to do that? Or is this something that can't be opened up here without doing harm, and that needs to be tabled, and then you offer alternative spaces to do that? So there are a variety of different ways to do it, but that's how I do it in my teaching.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Other questions, please. Feel welcome to unmute yourself. Well, here's one that's Allison Kennemer posted in the chat. Let me read it.
Yeah.
Deep and thoughtful presentation. Thank you so much. I like the example you gave with your brother-in-law. That seems to suggest that you believe that everyone can apply some of your rules in our day-to-day life to attempt to depolarize our personal environment. Do you believe so?
Yeah, I'm not bold enough to say that this is the solution for everybody, but I think that there are powerful ideas in this book that come from years and years of robust research. They're principles that, as I said, scale. And so there's a lot of power in these ideas, and they can be useful to you if you see the potential and if you feel comfortable in using them. Simply going for a walk, movement, is something to be mindful of, I think, particularly for mediators, because it's not something we're trained to do or think about, right? How do you get people physically up and doing something together? What does that look like? Where is that possibility? So I do think that there are ideas and principles from this that apply to everybody, but I will admit, these are challenging times, and people are easily triggered and alienated. 50% of America feels estranged from a member of their own family because of the politics today. So these are hard times where people are easily triggered. So be careful, but it's not hopeless, and we're not trapped in this thing. We can find a way out. Other societies have.
I think I have a question, and I really appreciate grappling with this subject, but how do you approach these conversations, these polarization, when there are actual victimization involved? Like when you have a young woman in Afghanistan who cannot, exercise her basic rights with a member of Taliban, how do you manage a conversation with them?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I recommend what I call positive deviance, which is finding groups that know how to do that, right? Know how to bring victims and perpetrators together safely in a constructive process, know how to bring, people across racial divides in a country where there's a legacy of white supremacy. How do you do that in ways that are effective? We know a lot about that. Some of these groups are very good at it. So in those situations, my recommendation is you don't do it alone. You go to places that know how to do that effectively and use those resources.
And do you think that this is a toxic polarization that people should get out? Like,
yeah, go ahead.
Because I mean, as a young woman that I am grappling with this polarization, I'm starting to think that maybe I shouldn't get out of all of these polarization. Maybe there is a reason that, we are in two sides of the spectrum.
Yeah. Really good question, a very important question. What I argue in the book is that times like this require two things. One is activists and fighting and lawyers and litigation and, and a justice system. And we really need that in order to keep the more destructive forces at bay. But if we're on the verge of political civil war, all of that is going to fall apart. So the question is, how do we understand the need for tension and confrontation, but find ways to grow the capacities or regrow the capacities for us to be civil and respectful with one another and insist on change? We need to be able to do both. And that is it's an idea called optimal tension. We use it around like diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism work, which is like within organizations, what is enough tension that those in power have to pay attention and make reparations and make reforms, but not so much so that they shut the system down. That's the question. And that is an important question that you raise. I happen to feel today that we are on the verge of extreme political violence and we need to ratchet it down so that we can continue to progress as a society.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you indeed. This was just a terrific presentation. We have more questions coming up, but we're out of time and we try to respect everyone's schedule, begin on time and end on time. Your wonderful book, once again, The Way Out, I highly commend it to everybody. If you're in a position to contribute to food banks, my friends, please consider supporting the West Side Campaign Against Hunger in New York City, www.wschah.org. Professor Peter Coleman, thank you so much. We look forward to having you back.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Yes, I'll come back when the adaptive mediation stuff is out.
Fantastic. With that, everyone, we are complete.
Goodbye. Thank you.